haven't already signed in at the back of the room, please do so before you leave today. That way, you'll be the first to know about our Saturday speaker series. So Madeline Feierstein is a historian from Alexandria, Virginia, specializing in American Civil War hospitals and prisons, with an additional research interest in psychiatric institutions and asylums. A native of Washington, D.C., her work has been showcased across the capital region. As a historian for the Lee Fendel House Museum and Garden, Madeline leads efforts to document the sick, injured, and imprisoned soldiers that passed through Civil War Alexandria. Additionally, she works at Gravestone Stories, interpreting the burials in Alexandria's historically rich cemeteries, and supports the National Museum of Civil War Medicine at their Clara Barton Missing Soldiers Office in Washington, D.C. Madeline holds a Bachelor's of Science in Criminology from George Mason University and a Master's of American History from Southern New Hampshire University.
Hi everyone, thanks so much for coming. You guys are really interested in such a dark and spooky topic. Love to see it. People just like me. So asylums, much like prisons and hospitals, fascinate us to this day. These institutions acted a lot like hospitals and prisons, incarcerating and confining those who society could not or would not care for. St. Elizabeth's Hospital, which still stands as a modern psychiatric care facility in Southeast Washington, was once the government hospital for the insane, open to follow emerging trends in the care of the mentally ill, and mere 6 years before the Civil War broke out, it was soon bombarded with a swarm of physically and emotionally injured soldiers. The Civil War was not just strategy, heroic generals on horseback, and gallantry in the face of danger. However, all three of these facets factor into the perceived manliness and honor of antebellum America. Facing mental health issues during a national crisis such as the Civil War came with its own layers of shame and ableism that we have thankfully discarded in our modern discourse. We must also consider that 1860s America was a nation in mourning, no matter what side of the conflict you found yourself on. Mental health concerns permeated entire family systems and continue to impact the next generation of Americans. While this lecture focuses on soldier health, there are many overlooked and underconsidered demographics, like who are also affected by this conflict, such as wives of fallen soldiers, husbands of brave nurses, mothers and fathers, sisters and brothers, and of course, their children. Lastly, and most surprisingly, it wasn't until 1980 when PTSD became an official mental health diagnosis. It was listed in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 3rd edition. The previous DSM-2 had titled this chronic condition as an adjustment disorder with transient situational disturbances. As we dive into the coming slides, this lack of formal recognition exacerbated the lack of proper care and attention needed to treat Civil War soldiers. But first, we must understand the psychiatric situation in America just prior to the onset of the sectional conflict, flowing disease, and flying bullets. The story of St. Elizabeth's could not be told without Quaker physician Thomas Story Kirkbride. All right, so Thomas Story Kirkbride promoted a moral treatment for the insane. Kirkbride designed dozens of stereotypically Gothic asylum structures whose blueprints remained in effect even after his death for an estimated 300 buildings. Known as the Kirkbride Plan, these structures shared similar features, design patterns, and corridors aimed to produce the greatest healing effects, as pictured in the slide image with this large corridor here. In tandem with providing ample sunlight for a curative effect for lunacy, Kirkbride helped solve the problem of overcrowding in city jails, where the mentally ill were often sent to in moments of distress or episode flare-ups, rather than a medical hospital to treat them. And then on this slide, we also have two other prominent examples of Kirkbride buildings. The top one is the Danvers State Hospital in Massachusetts. It's entirely demolished now. And then the one below it is the Worcester State Hospital, also Massachusetts, and that is all that remains of it. The corridor wings have been demolished. 2 years after the plans for St. Elizabeth's were approved, Kirkbride published on the Construction Asylum's National Register for Historic Places registration form a list when the additions to the complex were added. So by 1859, according to this document, there was ventilation and a heating system already in place within the complex. That's pretty fancy for 1859 America to have heating and essentially air conditioning, and have big open spaces and windows to open to allow the best possible care for these patients. The center building was completed in 1860 to house white patients. This 1859 to 1861 view illustrates the types of woods and materials used to construct it. And you can see people strolling to kind of look like, oh, it's a really ambient atmosphere. It's very calm here. You can stroll around the park if you want, right? Come over to St. Elizabeth's. Two detached lodges, the West Lodge in 1856 and the East Lodge in 1861, were designed for African American patients. Since its opening, the hospital treated both the rich and the poor, whites and blacks, men and women. For example, the former mayor of Alexandria, Peter Hewitt, was admitted to the asylum on January 10, 1861, quote, having entirely lost his mind through an accumulation of financial troubles. When you walk in these doors, it doesn't really matter who you are. You put on a gown and you're a patient of St. Elizabeth's. Here is a detailed description of the main complex and the various outbuildings. This is also between 1859 and 1861. We have an aerial view of the total space allotted for asylum use. So that's had a lot of grounds. Right? Even during active wartime, the asylum continued initiatives to grow and expand. So this is an 1864 survey of the neighboring farmland. The center building's right in the center there with all of its corridor wings. So you can see that they were scoping out land pretty far away to use for crops and eventual future outbuildings. Charles H. Nichols was named the first superintendent in 1852 while it was under construction. He remained in this post for 25 years until 1877. He was nominated by Dorothea Dix and personally selected by the outgoing President Fillmore. According to his 1889 obituary, which is pictured here, in the American Journal of Psychiatry, Nichols appropriated $120,000 to complete construction of this hospital during his residency. He had been previously working at the Bloomingdale Asylum in New York, and then once his posting ended here, went back to New York to continue working in psychiatry. As you can imagine, the nation's capital at the start of the war was a scene of utter chaos. Lincoln's fresh-faced and wide-eyed recruits poured into the semi-established city in the tens of thousands. Nurses, volunteer surgeons, and military doctors readied their minds and supplies, unexpecting the carnage to come. With its Virginia neighbor Alexandria providing a buffer against D.C.'s border with the Confederacy, and negotiated Maryland agreeing not to secede and trap the district, the city was poised to become the command center Lincoln needed it to be. The first general hospital, Washington Infirmary on E Street, had provided the district's main medical care, and there was an almshouse to care for the poor. St. Elizabeth's, though, quickly became the go-to center for mental illness, diverting this population away from the overcrowded jails and hospital beds intended for other folks in this metropolis. Washington and Alexandria soon transformed into the designated first stop for many injured and diseased soldiers, with an estimated combined total of 50 to 60 individual hospitals between them. There were many general hospitals, and they had pop-up branches that would open and close as needed. They would shut them down if it became too overcrowded, or they would open up new ones if the general hospitals were just getting too big. St. Elizabeth was the first, and until 1919, the only government facility to treat mentally ill military personnel. Also put that in perspective. The wartime shift affected the asylum, which was renamed St. Elizabeth's General Army Hospital when the war broke out, and it's listed among the most famous general hospitals in Civil War Washington. When we hear Civil War trauma, most of what comes to mind is gunshot wounds. In her compelling book, Bodies in Blue, Disability in Civil War North, historian Sarah Hadley Cousins notes that much of the scholarship surrounding the aftermath of trauma in the Civil War centers on amputations, which she has dismantled in her book and challenged our perception of disorder. Other historians like Dylan Carroll talk about this growing topic of discussion in his book, Invisible Wounds, Mental Illness in Civil War Soldiers, to illustrate that trauma was not straightforward in the 1860s, much as it isn't in 2025. I've included this illuminating chart from the American Battlefield Trust of the casualty counts from conflicts where American troops were activated. It truly encapsulates the health crisis that affected antebellum America and 1860s America. So if you combined all of the casualty counts from the wars below the Civil War, it still would not equal the total number here for Civil War, just for context too. The photo on the left is of Private Jackson O. Broshears from the Indiana Mounted Infantry. He shows one element of trauma in the Civil War. He was held at the Belle Isle Prison in Richmond for several months. Now he is 6'1", and when this photo was taken, he weighed 100 pounds. So he was released in 1864, and that he weighed at that time. Now, many POWs had experienced extreme deprivations. When we talk about trauma, this could be a triggering factor for a lot of them. On the right, we have a sketch by Alfred Wood, which depicts his eyewitness account of the Battle of the Wilderness, which many of you are familiar with. It was an egregious attack near Spotsylvania Courthouse that had raging fires sparked from the dry wood meeting rifle and cannon shots. General Grant is remembered for having wept in his tent that night because he could still hear the cries of soldiers on that battlefield that they could not get because of the raging fires. So trauma is flexible, it's fluid, but it's extremely concrete here in Civil War II. Anytime a soldier put their life in danger or witnessed their comrades fall on the battlefield, it could traumatize them, no matter how experienced or hardened the soldier might be. Before the formal diagnosis of PTSD, Dr. Jacob Mendez da Costa coined the term soldier's heart, which described those who experience symptoms of nostalgia, an inability to focus on the present due to a hyper-focus on the past. Dr. da Costa examined patients who showed cardiovascular issues and noted the presence of nervousness, especially when dreaming. Soldier's heart was initially used to explain irritable cardiac conditions among soldiers, but soon was looped in with more emotional symptoms, which they called excitement of battle. Irritable heart soon entered the medical dictionary, an index of diseases, such as this 1867 report written by da Costa, and is listed as a cardiac illness. And you can see how this term has evolved over the wars to terms maybe we're more familiar with today. Civil War America was plagued by a devastating combination of emergent medical science, quack doctors, old wives' tales, and a rejection of the germ theory that was proposed in Europe. No one knew why some blood transfusions worked and others didn't. It was understood that when infection set in, blood had been poisoned, and many young men, tens of thousands, were about to lose a limb. Starting in October 1861, there were weekly printings, like on the left here, of Humboldt's Extract Buchu, which detailed the maladies afflicting wartime Americans. This was a catch-all liquid that many Americans were encouraged to take for a whole array of symptoms. So many times people were injured just from taking medicines. And so what St. Elizabeth's wanted to do is try to promote real science, quote unquote, by the 1860s. And on the right side, we have an August 1864 Soldier's Journal article that warned soldiers of the dangers of insane asylums. They warned them to actually turn to religion and not have mental health symptoms because these places, like St. Elizabeth's, would harm you through experimental techniques and medical treatments, which again was not correct. It was just the fear of the time of institutions like asylums. We can surmise a great deal about the treatment options and level of care at St. Elizabeth's from the facilities and amenities available to soldiers. Superintendent Nichols, while maintaining his executive position, volunteered as a surgeon in the hospital that he ran. Additionally, he tended to the wounded at the Battle of First Bull Run under the direction of General McDowell. In the middle of the war, Dr. Nichols represented St. Elizabeth's at the 18th annual meeting of, wait for it, the Association of Superintendents of American Institutions for the Insane, which included big names in the industry, including Dr. Thomas Story Kirkbride himself. So here is his name listed as one of the reps of the big institutions in the country. The West Lodge was transformed into a hospital center for the Navy. In July 1864, the Secretary of the Navy was authorized to set a part of the soldiers' pay aside for admission and treatment in St. Elizabeth's. They had to pay for their own treatment, and it was docked from their military pension, military pay there. And also so that they could pay for all their resources and supplies, like their blankets, their clothes, their food, because the hospital became very inundated. One of the first mentions of soldier care includes a rather high-profile account of Fire Zouave Colonel Farnham. Colonel Noah L. Farnham of the 11th New York Volunteer Regiment was admitted on July 29, 1861 for derangement due to the wounds received at the Battle of First Bull Run a week before. From the medical and surgical history of the War of the Rebellion, we can gather that he suffered a superficial gunshot wound near his left parietal lobe, the top back of the head, and fell off his horse during battle. Although the wound healed, grave cerebral symptoms appeared, which led to hemiplegia, paralysis on one side of his body. He suffered from a concussion and irritation of the brain, which led to a coma and his prompt death a few weeks later in August. This New York Times obituary likened his demise to being so weakened by disease. All this can lead us to believe is that this gunshot wound to Farnham's head was likely the cause of his so-called derangement. I want to note that Colonel Farnham took the place and role of Colonel Elmer Ellsworth after Ellsworth's death, removing the Confederate flag from the Marshall House Hotel in Alexandria. President Lincoln, from the White House, could see this Confederate flag being flown through his binoculars. Alexandria had been captured a couple months earlier by Union troops. He's like, no, we're not going to have the Confederate flag flying in Union Alexandria. Someone go take that down. Ellsworth goes, volunteers, and gets shot by the proprietor, Jesse Jackson. And he's killed on the spot. And so Colonel Farnham here then takes the place of Ellsworth. So that was a big shoe to fill. Ellsworth kind of became a martyr for a lot of Union soldiers. His funeral was actually held in the White House. So it's a pretty big deal. You can also buy his action figure if you want to. Colonel Farnham has a figurine for sale as well. As of November 8, 1861, there were 34 documented soldiers receiving care for illnesses and wounds. The Alexandria Gazette reported 123 by August 1862. A February 1864 report on the far right totaled that there were 102 occupied beds and 98 vacant. So we have a total capacity of 200. Now, this may not seem like a massive institution compared to others in the Civil War era, but keep in mind that there were only 250 civilian patients allowed at any given time. We're now adding 200 military personnel, and these corridors were meant to be open spaces, no overcrowding allowed. This was an answer to the overcrowded hospitals. They really couldn't admit thousands upon thousands of soldiers. And St. Elizabeth still admitted civilian patients during the war, too. It did not stop that aspect of it. Cases of specific soldier insanity were published in the paper for all to read. There were frequent printings of soldier deaths, such as this December 14th, 1861 edition. So you can see I've highlighted specific soldiers who did die at St. Elizabeth's. Now, this stopped after 1862, because as you can imagine, it would be unmanageable to print all of the soldier deaths for all of those 85 hospitals around Alexandria and DC. So they stopped doing that after 1862. So on the right side, the Algor Hospital report, you can see that we have somebody transferred out. These soldiers needed to know that there was an option for them to receive mental health care. So anytime we would see the transfers, they would also list the insane asylum. So many soldiers could know, hey, I don't have to be stuck here at this military general hospital, and that the insane asylum isn't exactly a big scary place. A May 1862 visit from the Secretary of the Interior, several senators, and other officials detailed the amenities available to ailing soldiers. There were religious services in the chapel. We got some stables and washing facilities. This report also detailed that Dr. Nichols' supervision and management of the asylum provides much comfort and convenience and cleanliness to the patients. So there were a lot of official visits like this, because remember, this was the first time we are seeing a federal psychiatric institution. This was a great experiment in federal funding, so Congress really wanted to make sure it was working. So there's many intentions with these visits. A contradictory notice from the National Republican in October 1862 stated that the hospital within the insane asylum neglected soldiers, but the Ohio soldiers had plenty of care because benevolent societies, like nonprofits today, were giving them stuff, but just the Ohio soldiers. There were allegations that the surgeons and attendants provide scarce attention to the patients. A key feature of this article also says that the hospital wasn't really a hospital. It just specialized in amputations. So if you were admitted there, you're going to lose a limb. In January 1864, a Senate bill authorized the Secretary of the Interior to admit any person who became insane during the present war and who may be without means to support themselves. We now have involuntary admission of military personnel allowed by the Secretary of the Interior. Two reasons. One, to make sure people get cared for, but also they were worried about DC and Alexandria having unstable people running around. It was a security issue. This whole area was on lockdown. They wanted to make sure that there were no threats or potential issues or mishaps that could happen. Irregular asylum admissions did not cease or experience interruptions due to the war, as exemplified through this high-profile capture of a Patrick Rogers in July of 1864. So he had escaped jail and ran around town saying there had been a murder in the market. There was no such murder. All false, but he was causing panic. So they captured him and took him to St. Elizabeth's for treatment because he was causing a ruckus. As far as the highest profile visits and treatments are concerned, two come to mind. Sometime in the fall of 1862, Joseph Hooker, or General Hooker here, was admitted to the hospital for wounds sustained at the Battle of Antietam in September. This is a photo of him on horseback on the asylum grounds. Part of the hospital had been converted into a Union camp and Signal Corps station. And you can see that's the giant center building right behind him, those big corridors that jut out. President Lincoln visited several times and also threatened his wife, Mary Todd, with several stays at St. Elizabeth's due to her erratic behavior, especially after the tragic death of their young son, Willie, in the White House. He made sure to visit General Hooker while the general was convalescing. Soldiers who retreated at the asylum were received at the White House, most notably a group calling themselves the One-Legged Brigade. Now, I work at the Lee Fendall House and Museum in Alexandria. The Lee Fendall House was one of the 30 hospitals confiscated during the war, and we had some soldiers go to St. Elizabeth's too, so I kind of wanted to exemplify this today. The top left image shows our wonderful 1870s house with the cow out front. There used to be animals wandering around on the GW Parkway, believe it or not. And then our modern museum today, which has had very few renovations to it. So the house was confiscated in April of 1863 in the Alexandria's 3rd Division. Here is a quartermaster's map of the premises, which denotes how we have a pump, a sink, and in the top left corner, our dead house. This was a makeshift garden shed aimed to house deceased soldiers before burial. The hospital admitted 1,700 soldiers. 100 soldiers died within its walls. We are actually doing a 160th commemorative anniversary of the Lee Fendall House's time as a hospital in April. So we're going to have the U.S. Army there. We have other officials from Alexandria dedicate a memorial plaque to the hospital's years and for the soldiers who did die within its walls. If anybody's interested and in town, say more information about that later. So, the information that I'm about to tell you did come directly from the medical ledgers of the Grosvenor Branch Hospital. So we have a James Tilton and a Stanford D. Ward who were admitted on the same day, January 20th, 1865, from the Washington Street Prison. This was a cotton factory in Alexandria that was confiscated for use as a prison. It was the most notorious prison in Civil War Alexandria. The superintendent of prisons, Rufus Petit, had a particular campaign against deserters. He found it to be his mission to thwart out and prevent disloyal Union soldiers from returning to the battlefield. And so the conditions here kind of turned to an interrogation center. So we don't know why Tilton and Ward were admitted into our hospital, but we can surmise that because they were transferred on the same day, February 7th, to the asylum, they were probably experiencing enough mental health symptoms for the doctors or the surgeons to transfer them out. The record gets a little murky from there. I was able to determine that Tilton's wife, Rebecca, had filed her widow's pension in 1890, so we get a date of Tilton's death. So he's released from the asylum and he gets his pension. But there's no record of a Stanford Ward across numerous databases or from the 80th New York muster roll from the New York Military Museum. It's as if he doesn't exist or he burned his paper trail. My theory is that that's a fake name. Maybe he did desert and he was captured and he's not Stanford Ward. Maybe he's John Smith from a different unit. This was a way for soldiers to avoid being sent back to the field or repercussions for deserting. But there was a man who happened to be named Stanford Ward. I just don't think that was his real name. The third transferee is a troubling case. 16-year-old Philander McDonald was admitted to Grosvenor Branch Hospital and transferred to St. Elizabeth's on the same day. This indicates he was exhibiting enough mental health symptoms to usher a very speedy and quick delivery to the asylum. Now, he's 16, he lied about his age. His service record says 18, okay? So I want you to imagine lying on a cot in a hospital at 16. You are experiencing enough symptoms that they're not going to treat you. They're going to transfer you again to a bigger institution. How scary that could be. There's only one record of his enlistment here in the U.S. Army Register of Enlistments, which details a lot more about him. You can get that he's from Madison County, Ohio. He enlisted in August of 1864. He's 5'5", he had hazel eyes, dark hair, and a fair complexion. We are able to determine that Philander was discharged in June 1865 from the asylum and from military service for insanity. He had previously deserted in September of 1864, and he was AWOL for 2 days before he was captured. This could possibly lead to his chain of custody. He had been captured, sent to Alexandria for questioning, maybe experienced some traumatic stress here, and then he was transferred to St. Elizabeth's. St. Elizabeth's care for Civil War soldiers did not end when Lee surrendered to Grant Appomattox, nor after the Reconstruction Amendments were passed, nor when the occupation in the South was lifted. The psychiatric care and records of this institution were just getting started. The asylum's launch was interrupted by a national conflict, and now St. Elizabeth's could begin to explore new psychiatric care techniques and emerge as a leader in the field of mental health treatment. Following the Civil War, St. Elizabeth's expanded to accommodate the needs of aging and mentally challenged Civil War veterans. The Civil War did not stop its expansion. In 1867, the asylum purchased new land and surveyed it. One of the most notable changes in the landscape included this Civil War cemetery. So we have here a note from its National Register for Historic Places application and the original dimensions of this. So the Civil War cemetery is formerly known as the West Campus Cemetery, which is near the main big Gothic scary building. In 1873, its grounds became overcrowded with over 600 graves. So the East Campus Cemetery, which is pictured at the top here, how big that is, was founded. It has over 5,000 burials and includes burials of civilians and veterans who had fought in the War of 1812, Civil War, Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, and one African-American scout from the Seminole War, actually. So, in the service record of Dr. Nichols lies an admissions list that was personally ordered to be counted by the Secretary of War in 1868. So we still have people being treated at St. Elizabeth's who had fought in the Civil War. Notably here, I highlighted in red, they're still categorizing people as rebel prisoner. And we also have a note of colored patients as well, United States colored troops, soldiers still being treated. So it truly shows the unity that medicine can forge in times of national strife, that the rebel soldier was not returned to the South untreated before his treatment was complete. Now, there's a massive register of patients from 1876 to 1890. I have selected 3 patients whose admission was a direct result of their service in the Civil War. First Lieutenant John Adair was admitted to the asylum in March 1876 for chronic mania caused by a wound in his neck. He remained confined to St. Elizabeth's for 6 years until his death in 1882. It might seem odd to connect a neck wound to mania, but it's likely that he suffered from post-traumatic stress or pain that was so extreme it would trigger or mimic symptoms of mania. He was buried back home in Pennsylvania with his family. Private Albert Hansel was still enlisted in the Army when he was admitted in November 1877 for acute mania caused by hardships of service. Originally from Germany, he died at the asylum in 1882 and is buried in the East Campus Cemetery. Admitted in February 1878, Private Patrick Doherty was treated for recurrent mania caused by a shell wound of the head. A native of Ireland, Doherty was medically discharged from the service after receiving a saber cut to the forehead at Brandy Station. While the injuries may have been altered slightly, we can deduce that this young man suffered from potential traumatic brain injury or post-traumatic stress from the ordeal. He was marked as improved and released 4 months later. Notably here, he's also listed as eloped at the very end, which could have been a symptom of the mania they were documenting. During Reconstruction and into the mid-20th century, the asylum added a myriad and a magnitude of additional outbuildings. So this coupled with the new experimental treatments for all mentally ill patients in the United States lobotomies, medication, shock treatment. So a lot of the facilities were not just to house people, but also as like little cottages to do treatments. Now we're going to see a diversion from the Kirkbride plan. Kirkbride intended all care to be done within the main complex, allow a lot of open air. But the Allison buildings, okay, were used for the military veterans of the Civil War. This one, 1899, was constructed specifically for white male Civil War veterans. And now these are in cottage style. They're not part of the main complex. We're seeing a shift away from one massive building to like summer camp cabins that are more common today in mental health facilities. Allison A, B, C, and D were all constructed since 1878, used to house this aging population. And possibly the three gentlemen I highlighted earlier were housed in one of these complexes. In 1987, after decades of decline, Congress began shutting down the main complex and the center building. A new, modern East Campus had been built. One of its first and most notable patients was John Hinckley Jr., recently apprehended for the assassination attempt of President Ronald Reagan. By 2002, all patients were transferred away from the older West Campus. The complex sat abandoned, save for the occasional illegal entry and historic tour. It loomed as the creepy Kirkbride building we view it as. In 2007, Department of Homeland Security announced plans to convert the campus into its new headquarters. Construction broke ground in 2015, and the project was completed 4 years later. St. Elizabeth's Asylum, the government hospital for the insane, was the first institution to create a psychotherapy department in a mental hospital, and the first public mental health hospital to be accredited to train medical interns. Its legacy and veteran care carry on in the East Campus, and the shell of this former powerhouse in American asylums still echo the stories of those soldiers who had to call it home, even if temporarily. Thank you. Guess we'll open the floor to any questions anybody has. A little Q&A session. Yes, please.
Is the cemetery still there?
Yes, both are. You can visit the East Cemetery. The West Cemetery, the Civil War Cemetery, is within the gate. So you can't just walk onto the campus because that's now DHS. But you can go to the fence, which is on Martin Luther King Boulevard, and look at it from afar. That is totally allowed. It's a little disheveled. It was built on a hill, and with a lot of rain and mudslides, a lot of the headstones have tilted down to the point where they're not matching up with their headstone. So even if you looked at it, there's a lot more graves there than meets the eye. Very good question. Yes, please.
I had read that the asylum closed in 2006, but there was now still a hospital.
Yeah, they do. It's yep, same name. So the East Campus, which is a modern glass building, is called St. Elizabeth's. So after they shut down the West Campus, they just moved everybody there, and this became nothing. The shell of it here on the other side, it's boarded up, and it's been sitting there, looming.
So there is not too much time.
No. Yes, please.
What's the patient population now?
Now, as modern one, I'm not entirely sure.
290.
290. Thank you. Which again does not divert very much from the original Kirkbride plan of having 250 patients. So very good information. Thank you. Yes, please.
They seem to use the term mania very interchangeably.
Yes.
What were they
Describing here?
Yeah, what did they actually mean?
It's a great question. So when we say insanity, of course, the way I've used it today is the way they used it, and that's a big term. Mania could mean irritability. It could mean just general excitement. It could mimic symptoms of psychosis. Psychosis was not a term they really used back then. Also, anytime someone was making quick decisions, eloping, spending lots of money, mania just described a heightened sense of emotion. It could be anger, it could be extreme joy, but it was too much. It was too much emotion at one time. Unless it was depressive, that'd be just considered depression. That makes sense. I use a catch-all term for general irritability or too much talkativeness, too much energy.
So it's excess, not...
Yeah, excess. Very much excess, yeah. So it was used a lot for soldiers who potentially experienced post-traumatic stress symptoms like night terrors, or if they became a little paranoid about an experience they're having in real time, to explain an excess and an extreme version of emotion. Yeah, thank you. Please.
Are there tours
tours of this building?
You know, there were. The General Service Administration did give guided tours. Now, if you go to their website, they'll say that the historic tours for 2025 are planned, but registration information is coming soon. There's been some employment concerns in who is available to give these tours because it's run by a federal facility. But they do give historic tours. I am also eagerly waiting that registration link as well to go back. But yeah, it's open. You can't go in the building. You never were able to go in the building, even during this time period. I went on a tour in 2019, and we just went around it, which is still pretty cool. So yeah, be on the lookout. Please.
I heard that Mary Todd Lincoln at one time was put into an insane asylum.
Yes.
Where was that?
No, I do not know where that was. Do we know?
Illinois,
Back home?
but I'm not sure she actually went. She benefited from the legislation
Yeah.
that allowed hearings and things. So I think she actually never went to an asylum.
Right. She was definitely threatened with it. Absolutely. By Abraham and by her son Robert, because she was so inconsolable and unmanageable.
And there's a wonderful book called The Insanity Files.
Yes.
It turned out her son, after he discovered this whole tranche of paper in the family vacation home that they were selling. And it's all about her issues.
Right. Right.
And he decided, kind of wisely, instead of destroying it all, to turn it over to a couple of historians who can actually read all the documents.
Those little decisions that people make to keep stuff and to document are so incredible. Thank you.
She was there actually for at least about 3 months. She was able to enlist the assistance of a woman lawyer
Yeah.
to help her get out. So she was actually there for a few months, but she did.
Right. So Mary Todd, though, was definitely threatened with stays at St. Elizabeth's because it was not just the only, but it was also the preeminent one. If you were high profile, you would definitely go there. Yes. Please bring it back.
Any reports of hauntings or spectral activity?
I'm going to say yes, because how can there not be? I mean, even just get rid of the Civil War period for a second. This has been a hospital since 1855. I mean, it's been thousands of deaths within its buildings. Trauma can absorb into the walls, right? So there's a little paranormal thing for you guys called the stone tape theory, that any natural material like brick, wood, stone absorbs vibrations from events like shouting or crying or things, and it can replay as like a tape recorder. Stone tape theory. This is something that some paranormal investigators will cite. So that's why we see sometimes ominous feelings. You're like, ooh, it's kind of weird in here. This is a creepy building. I mean, just look at it. How can it not be? I work at a very haunted museum in Alexandria, so I'm a little partial to that theory, but I would not be surprised. Thank you. Yes, please.
You were saying that it's federally funded, so
Yeah.
how often was this used as a dumping ground for women?
Oh, yes. So in the corridors, like many Kirkbride buildings, the entire one side of the building would be for men and for women. That's actually what they did in Weston State Hospital in West Virginia. This one, I believe they had the rooms separated. When I was looking at the 1870s, 80s, and 90s records, I saw a lot of admissions for women due to symptoms of post-childbirth or unable to maintain the home. Though after the Civil War, other psychiatric facilities did pop up in DC, because after the Civil War, it became almost double the population, because people started to live in the district versus Alexandria or in Maryland. So eventually this was not the only psychiatric facility, but initially, yes, it did become a dumping ground and as an answer to women's hysteria of the time, very much. Please.
Is there any way that you can get your records if you know of a relative?
Yeah.
I tried at Weston and I couldn't get anything.
I wouldn't be surprised because the records for St. Elizabeth's are at the National Archives. I would check with them, but so did you contact the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum directly?
I did.
Okay. I don't know if they keep their records. Maybe you can ask them if they keep the records at the National Archives or the Library of Congress. I wouldn't be surprised if they offloaded a lot of their documents to another facility, especially since that one I don't think has a big research library on site. It's possible that the county that it's in also has records. I would try that too. Yeah, or the state, if need be. Contact everybody. Yeah. Yes.
Just to say for St. Elizabeth's, if anybody has a record that they're interested in historically, they can talk to me.
Oh, wonderful.
I work in the archives.
Oh, love it. Yay, got expert here. Excellent. Thank you. It's really great information. Any other questions, please?
That one picture that you showed of the patients in the hallway
Yes.
with the very clear
clean, white,
I'll get to it. Yeah.
um, sheet over him. That looks so different from the pictures that you see of patients in Civil War hospitals.
There we go. Sorry, I'm getting to it. Got to reshare.
It was so clean, and the
Talking about this one?
no, I think much further.
The picture.
On the porch.
Yes, they're on the floor.
The third right. On the,
Oh, you mean of General Hooker? Or
Running.
oh, I'm sorry. This one. I know what you're talking about. I got you. There's a lot of photos on here. Okay. This one.
Yes.
Yes.
So that looks so clean. As opposed
Yeah.
to pictures you see of.
Right. Well, let's also put in context. This is a staged photo.
Pardon?
It's a staged photo. So I wouldn't be surprised if they had cleaned this up. But this is actually St. Elizabeth's here. I mean, that poor man with his arm up. I mean, I think he would rather the photographers not be there that day to photograph him. Yeah. So that was very clean. This would likely be, again, this is the common treatment also for tuberculosis at the time. You put them on like a porch and just open the windows because that would treat the illness before we had medication for it. So this was the clean air, open air theory that Kirkbride really wanted to promote also for mental health conditions. So they're on wheels. These beds are on wheels. They can be dragged out. So yeah, I'm surprised too, but it's very much staged.
Yeah.
You wouldn't have all those doctors there at one time either. That's too unrealistic. Thank you though. Anything else I can answer for you guys? Do we have any questions in our chat from our live stream? Is there anything there? Oh no? Okay. Great. Well, we're going to end. So thank you guys so much. I'm going to hang around. I have cards, my business cards, in case anyone wants them. On my website, I do have events that I'll be doing throughout the DC region, up in here in Frederick. So I hope you enjoy the rest of your Saturday. Thank you.